No one really notices the exact moment when meaning begins to fade. There's no clear sign, no sudden drop. Sometimes it's just an ordinary morning. You wake up and feel like everything is the same. The same bed, the same weight on your shoulders, the same mechanical gestures as you get up, get ready, and carry on. But deep inside, something has broken, and you still don't know the name of what you've lost. It's as if life is happening far away from you. Laughter sounds fake, commitments feel pointless, and even the people you love start to feel distant. You respond with automatic smiles, pretend to care, keep showing up, but your soul isn't really there anymore. It's wandering inside, searching for a meaning it can no longer find. This feeling of emptiness doesn't come out of nowhere. It builds up silently, stacked on top of small moments when you ignore yourself to please others, stay quiet to avoid conflict, or pull away from who you are just to fit into places that were never yours. Little by little, you forget what truly made your soul come alive. And by the time you realize it, you're just surviving. You start to ask yourself, what's the point of all this? And that question, which once seemed small, turns into a kind of shadow that follows you everywhere. It becomes a growing discomfort, a tiredness that no amount of sleep can fix, a sadness that doesn't scream, but weighs heavily. It's not about being unhappy with something specific. It's deeper than that. It's about not feeling anything at all. But maybe this emptiness is an invitation. Because when meaning disappears, it's a sign that you need to find it again, but this time, somewhere else. Not out there, but within. Carl Jung deeply lived this emptiness and the confrontation with the unconscious. He didn't speak only as a theorist, but as someone who dove into his own darkness during one of the most intense personal crises of his life, especially after breaking away from Freud. That period led him into an inner collapse of sorts, where he faced visions, powerful symbolic dreams, and even moments of doubt about his own sanity. And it was precisely that inner journey that allowed him to develop much of his psychology, including the concepts of the self, individuation, and the importance of listening to the soul. Jung didn't speak about emptiness from a distance. He knew what it was like to lose the ground beneath his feet. After breaking with Freud, his mentor, his friend, the most important figure in his life at the time, Jung entered a dark period. He described it himself as though his soul had withdrawn. The ideas that once sustained him no longer worked, and all that remained was an almost unbearable inner silence. But it was within that silence that he truly began to listen. During that time, Jung faced intense inner images, symbolic dreams, and visions that forced him to look inward like never before. He didn't run from what he felt. On the contrary, he dove straight into it. And it was precisely that painful process that allowed him to understand what so many of us silently go through. He realized that the soul, when ignored for too long, begins to suffer. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It withdraws. And in its place, it leaves behind a suffocating emptiness. This emptiness, according to Jung, is the clearest sign that we've strayed from the self, the deepest center of our psyche, our truest self. The loss of meaning, the exhaustion, the lack of motivation that won't go away, all of it might be a reflection of a life that no longer aligns with the soul. It's not weakness. It's the symptom of an inner abandonment. Jung discovered that this silence isn't the end. It's a calling, a plea from the soul asking you to come back, to listen, to stop shaping yourself around what others expect, and to finally start asking, what really matters to me? Because when the soul is heard, the emptiness slowly begins to transform. Gently but deeply. There are moments in life when everything you used to do out of obligation, expectation, or survival just isn't enough anymore. That's when the silent question becomes an inner cry. Why keep going? Not in a dramatic way, but in a profound one. It's a cry for truth. A genuine desire to find a reason to keep moving forward with your heart still intact. And it was this kind of pain that Viktor Frankl knew all too well. An Austrian physician, psychiatrist, and thinker, he went through such extreme human experiences that it would have been easy to lose all faith in life. But instead, he discovered something essential. The human being can endure almost any pain as long as there is a why. As long as there is meaning, however small, to give direction to one's existence. That discovery became the core of everything he would later teach. For Frankl, the emptiness so many people feel isn't just sadness, it's the absence of purpose, a hole where meaning used to be. And that absence slowly eats away at you. It dims the brightness of your accomplishments. It makes each day feel heavier. It's like living on the outside while being completely extinguished on the inside. That's why he used to say, suffering doesn't need to be erased at all costs. What it needs is meaning. Because suffering with meaning can transform. But suffering without meaning, it sickens, empties, and destroys you from the inside out. This perspective is profoundly liberating. Because even when everything feels out of control, even when the world around you fails, there is still something no one can ever take away from you. The freedom to find your own why. It doesn't have to be something grand. Sometimes, what gives your life meaning is something simple. Taking care of someone, creating something, keeping alive a silent promise you once made to yourself. Frankl saw despair as a legitimate cry from the soul for a real reason to keep going. And that reason, no matter how small it may seem, can be the spark that reignites everything you thought was lost. Despair isn't always a collapse. Sometimes it's an attempt, a final effort of the soul to be heard. When everything else fails, when you can no longer pretend, when the world loses its flavor and even silence begins to hurt, despair shows up. But it doesn't come as punishment. It comes as a cry, a plea for help from the deepest part of your psyche. Jung saw these moments as opportunities, not in some shallow, optimistic way, but as psychic openings, cracks through which the unconscious tries to reach the conscious mind. For him, an emotional collapse could mark the beginning of an inner transformation. Something inside you is dying, and that's terrifying. But maybe it's not you that's dying, maybe it's the life you were living, the way you treated yourself, the roles you clung to, the masks you wore. Despair is not the destruction of your being, it's the destruction of what no longer serves you. When it shows up, it means everything you've tried has failed. The distractions, the ready-made advice, the easy shortcut. Nothing hides the hole that's been growing inside you anymore. And that's exactly when something new can begin. Because there's nowhere left to run. And for the first time, you might finally be willing to face what you've been avoiding, yourself. That's why Jung said that symptoms, deep sadness, constant emptiness, mental confusion, are letters from the soul. And they only stop arriving once they've been read. Despair, then, is less of an end and more of a beginning. A call. Life is asking to be lived in a different way. And maybe, even in pain, that call is your chance to truly begin. Some pain doesn't come from the present. It comes from far back. These are parts of you that got stuck in time, hidden behind behaviors, obligations, and automatic smiles. Jung called this hidden part the shadow. It holds everything you couldn't accept, fears, anger, desires, traumas, parts of yourself you once buried just to keep going. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it's been ignored for too long, it takes over. That's why, in moments of despair, you feel like you've lost control. You react in ways you don't understand. You push away the people you love. You begin to see yourself as someone you never wanted to be. It's not weakness. It's not madness. It's the shadow making itself known because it refuses to be forgotten any longer. The shadow doesn't appear to destroy you. It appears to be integrated. So you'll stop breaking yourself into pieces trying to please the world while abandoning yourself. It shows up in emptiness, in extreme exhaustion, in loss of meaning, because it's in these moments that the masks fall. And what's left there, when everything has collapsed, is your rawest truth. The one you've spent your whole life trying to hide, from yourself and from others. But here's the turning point. When the shadow takes over, it also reveals. It shows what needs healing. It exposes the wounds that were never treated. And if you can look at that without judgment, what once felt like destruction can become redemption. Because the shadow carries power. It holds everything you've left behind, including the strength you forgot you had. And it's in this very moment, when the shadow rises and buried truths emerge, that something greater begins to crumble. The mask you wore to survive. The mask you wore to survive begins to fall apart. On the surface, you may still look like the same person. But inside, everything is changing. The persona, as Jung called it, is that social role we wear to be accepted. It's the edited version of ourselves, more polished, stronger, more functional. And for a while it works. It serves its purpose, to protect, to ensure belonging, to ease relationships. But eventually it starts to suffocate, because the persona wasn't built to carry the weight of the soul. It can't handle the depth of the pain you feel in silence. It can't withstand human contradictions, inner conflicts, unresolved traumas. It works for the outside world, but it no longer fits the world that is growing inside you. And so, slowly it begins to crack. You start saying no when you used to say yes. You begin to question everything you thought you wanted. You start distancing yourself from environments that once made you feel good or at least seemed to. You grow irritated by superficiality, by haste, by the pressure to feel a joy you no longer recognize. This isn't loss of control. It's liberation. The mask is falling not because you've failed, but because you're finally getting closer to who you really are. And this is the point where many people get scared. Because losing the persona is terrifying. It was your protection, your identity, your safety. But if you let it fall, as uncomfortable as it may be, what begins to rise in its place is something infinitely more real, a version of you that doesn't live to please, but to listen to yourself. And as that listening deepens, you begin to pass through something Jung called the dark night of the soul, a silent, profound, and inevitable crossing. You begin to pass through something Jung called the dark night of the soul, a silent, profound, and inevitable crossing. It's not a regular phase of sadness or doubt. It's heavier. It feels like everything that once gave meaning has evaporated, leaving behind only a void you can't name. It's not loud suffering, the kind that screams for help. It's quiet, lonely suffering that lingers in the corners of your day, that makes you stare at the ceiling at night unsure if you're still the same person you once were. This dark night is not a punishment. It's a process. Jung saw this descent as an essential part of individuation, the path back to oneself, which demands that you go down, face it, fall apart, yes, but move through it with courage. Because there are no shortcuts to the soul. Every real transformation passes through that territory where you feel lost, without a map, without an anchor, without any promise of immediate light. It's in that moment that everything external begins to lose its value. Other people's opinions no longer matter. Distractions no longer work. The world's superficiality bothers you more than it entertains. You don't want to pretend anymore. You don't want to force yourself. You just want something real, even if it hurts, even if it takes time, even if no one else understands. And that's when the true reconnection with your deepest self begins. Because in that darkness, when your old identity dissolves, the soul finally finds space to whisper. But before you can hear that voice, you'll still need to resist the urge to run, to escape discomfort. And that escape, even when disguised as a normal life, is exactly what can pull you away from what most needs to be faced. That escape, even when dressed as normal life, is exactly what can distance you from the very thing that needs to be touched. Because the pain that bothers you is the same one that's asking to be heard. But in the attempt to avoid that discomfort, most people take paths that seem easier, but only extend the suffering. You try to keep yourself busy all the time. You turn on the TV, scroll through social media, bury yourself in work, say yes to soulless commitments. You buy what you don't need, plan what you don't feel. You numb yourself. Smiling becomes mechanical, and silence, which could have been a space for healing, becomes unbearable. All of this is escape, disguised as routine, as normalcy, as productivity, but still escape. What you resist persists, and while you try to deny the emptiness, it remains there, just expressing itself in different ways. Persistent anxiety, unexplained exhaustion, sudden anger, shapeless sadness. The soul doesn't disappear when ignored, it just finds new ways to scream. And the more you try to silence it, the more it will find ways to remind you that it still exists. The false path seems safe, seems comfortable, but it's the one where many people lose themselves for years, until their bodies begin to break down, relationships fall apart, and life loses meaning, even when filled with activity. Because what was missing was never just time or action. It was presence, listening, courage. And only when you allow yourself to stop, when you stop running and begin to listen to what comes from within, does something start to shift. At first, it's subtle, a different kind of restlessness, a sincere discomfort, a tiredness that no longer wants to be denied. That's where the possibility of reunion begins, not with who you used to be, but with who you may have always been, yet never had the space to become. That's where the possibility of reunion begins, not with who you were, but with who you may have always been, but never had room to be. Because after so long running from yourself, the simple act of stopping and listening can feel strange. At first, all you hear is noise, racing thoughts, doubts, uncomfortable memories. But if you keep showing up, if you stay with that silence and remain present, something begins to rise. Your own truth. Real listening isn't easy. It takes silence, courage, and patience. It's not just about closing your eyes. It's about opening your heart to whatever shows up. And it won't always be beautiful. You may discover wounds that still ache, regrets you've never processed, fears that have controlled you for years. But you'll also find a part of yourself that has survived it all. A quiet but honest voice. A forgotten but living wisdom. Jung believed that the soul never stops speaking. It's us who stop listening. And when we finally choose to hear it, it doesn't shout. It whispers. Gently but firmly. It reminds you who you are, beyond the roles you play, beyond the burdens you carry. It reminds you of what you used to love before the world told you what was right. It shows you, little by little, that the meaning of life doesn't come pre-made, it's built out of what's real to you. This listening is not a one-time event. It's a process. And the closer you get to it, the more you realize the emptiness begins to reorganize itself. It doesn't vanish overnight, but it starts to open up space. And in that space, a new kind of presence begins to grow, lighter, more truthful, more connected to what truly matters. And when you draw near that inner center, you begin to understand that even the pain that brought you here might have had an important role. And when you draw near that inner center, you begin to understand that even the pain that brought you here might have had an important role. Because some pain doesn't come to punish. It comes to awaken. It comes to interrupt a life that strayed too far from itself. It comes to make you look, not outward anymore, but inward. Viktor Frankl spoke about this with rare clarity. Suffering doesn't need to be erased. It needs meaning. And that meaning isn't always logical, explainable, or beautiful. Sometimes it's simply what you choose to do with the pain. The way you decide to rebuild yourself from it. The decision not to let it define you, but to let it transform you. Jung also saw suffering as an essential part of the individuation process. The pain you feel isn't a flaw in the system. It's an invitation. It appears when you've disconnected from your truth, when you've lived too much for others, ignored your intuition, suppressed everything you felt just to avoid being a burden. And now it's here, not as an enemy but as a guide. Of course, that doesn't mean we should romanticize suffering. It hurts. It drains you. It can push you to the edge. But it can also reveal a strength you didn't know you had. Because the person who walks through their own pain with presence comes out the other side more whole, more awake, more free. Pain, when listened to honestly, begins to point you inward. And in that silent gesture of turning toward yourself, something begins to shift. You stop being just someone who suffers and start becoming someone who awakens. And that awakening isn't the end of suffering, but the beginning of a new way of existing, with more truth and more awareness. This awakening is not the end of suffering, but the beginning of a new way of existing, with more truth and more awareness. Slowly, you start to realize that the meaning of life doesn't lie in grand answers, but in small reconnections. It doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation. It builds itself, quietly, from the simplest gestures that come from your truth. Maybe what gives your days meaning isn't some grand mission, but the care you offer someone you love, the art you create in silence, the honesty with which you allow yourself to feel. Maybe it's the small choice not to abandon yourself today, to listen to your body, to honor what hurts without guilt. That's where meaning lives, not in the ideal, but in the real. Frankl said that the meaning of life is something personal, non-transferable. There is no manual. There is no formula. There is only your path, and it reveals itself as you walk, as you stay, as you take a deep breath and choose to continue, even without knowing what comes next. And Jung echoed this idea with deep insight. Meaning is not something you invent. It's something you discover when you align with the self, with that which pulses within you in an authentic, quiet, whole way. When you listen, when you feel, when you live from the inside out, the emptiness no longer takes up so much space. You don't go back to who you were before. And that's a blessing, because what you find now is much more than identity. It's internal belonging. You begin to inhabit yourself. And living, then, becomes less about winning and more about respecting yourself. And in that respect, in that self-compassion, in that sincere step, you discover there's still life inside you. And that it never stopped existing, it was only waiting to be touched with truth. You discover there's still life inside you. And that it never stopped existing, it was only waiting to be touched with truth. Because the despair that once felt like the end may have actually been the beginning. You don't need to have all the answers right now. You don't need to be healed, enlightened, or fully ready to start over. Sometimes, all you need is a lighter breath, a moment of peace in the middle of the chaos. And that's already a sign that something inside you is still here, steady, even after everything. Meaning doesn't arrive like lightning. It's built in the everyday, in the courage to speak the truth, in the tenderness of honoring your own time, in the simple act of listening to yourself with love. Despair shook you, broke you down, forced you to stop. But now it can also guide you inward, because when everything falls apart, only what is essential remains. And that essential, no matter how invisible it may be to the eyes, is what sustains you. You don't need to go back to who you were. Maybe all of this happened so that you could become who you were always meant to be, just without the masks, without the rush, without the chains.